don't want to know today where the products come from that we consume. We don't want to know the conditions of labor that harvest the coffee beans or the T-shirts that we wear. I mean, some people are trying to make us more aware of this, but we're all pretty good at closing our eyes to these kind of realities. The Fugitive Slave Law made slavery real, personal, and vividly alive in the eyes of Northerners who had previously been able to look away. If you saw somebody who'd been living in your town for 10 or 15 years being dragged in chains to the courthouse, tried in a summary fashion without anything resembling due process, and taken off to the pier to be shipped back to slavery, it was very hard to get up the next morning and say, this is not my problem. So in fact, one of the big industrialists of the North, Amos Lawrence, in 1854, when the fugitive Anthony Burns was sent back from Boston into slavery, said, "We went to bed good, compromised Union Whigs, conservatives that is. We woke up stark, mad abolitionists." So the fugitive slave reality radicalized a lot of people in the North. And the abolitionists, black and white, understood that it had the power to do that. Frederick Douglass said, as odious and indefensible as it was, the Fugitive Slave Law was a great service to the anti-slavery movement, because it put in front of the eyes human beings who, and as in Douglass's own case, told their stories, delivered speeches, wrote memoirs. They became flesh and blood human beings rather than abstractions. And maybe that's what it takes to activate people to be concerned. I believe you have asked about parallels over time. I believe that the strategy of the abolitionists to put fugitives in front of the people bears a very close resemblance to the strategy of Dr. King in the 1950s and 60s, who understood that, horrific as it was, if he put the images of children being attacked by police dogs and young people being blown off the street by fire hoses or dragged out of the diner because they were sitting at the counter trying to order a hamburger. If you put those images on television, which of course didn't exist in 1850, there would be enough people throughout the United States who would be at the least embarrassed and at the most appalled by what they were seeing, and that the political culture would shift. And he was right. It was a great vote of confidence in the fundamental decency of the American people. The abolitionists of the 1840s and 1850s cast the same vote. They believed that at the end of the day, there would be more people horrified by slavery than there would be people indifferent to it. And I think over time they were proven to be right.
Now, I don't like the term tipping point in history because it can, I think, maybe flatten the complexities of what's happening on the ground.
Right.
So help me understand this with fugitive slaves affecting people's perceptions. A common narrative of the Civil War is that only deep into the Civil War was there really a strong Northern will for emancipation. Before that, at least from a political angle, people wanted some sort of reconciliation to keep the Union together rather than full emancipation. Do you see the seeds being planted by the Fugitive Slave Act and then fully blooming in emancipation? Or was the, for lack of a better term, the tipping point, do you see the Fugitive Slave Act or something else, or a combination of factors?
Well, I share your reluctance to talk about tipping points, but I think one of the main insights of historians over the last 20 or 30 years has been that we have tended to be too stingy about crediting black people themselves with pushing forward the cause of emancipation. And you can see, I mean, it's not that there wasn't a significant black-white alliance in the years before the Civil War and during the war, but black people, by exercising the personal courage of running from slavery and then testifying in public to the reality from which they had run, they did turn they changed the temperament of the political culture. They moved it to a new place. And while you're perfectly right that many Northerners, when they agreed that the Southern Rebellion needed to be put down by military means, were in it only for the preservation of the Union, and many Northern conservatives were very reluctant to go anywhere near the idea of emancipation. The logic of the war itself led inevitably to that, and once again, fugitive slaves played an enormous role, because as soon as the Union Army began to penetrate into Confederate territory, one consequence was the creation of a huge new population of fugitive slaves, fugitives who were now under the protection of the Union Army. And before the end of the war, again, there was reluctance to go to this step, but before the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African Americans enlisted in the Union Army, many of whom had formerly been enslaved. So the former slaves joined the battle in a variety of different ways, and at the end of the day, by bearing arms as well. And I think, clearly, without their role, this story would have been very different. We've come a long way. I don't think we tell the story of emancipation anymore as the great white father, finally condescending to grant liberty to these poor primitive black people, which is the way the story was once told. Mm-hmm. It was a much more complicated story than that, and I think fugitive slaves played an enormously important role in it.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Well, I want to give due time to a large point in your book, and that's the legacies of slavery that divide us today. And what you touched on was impetus to write this book on what you see on contemporary parallels. So after the Civil War is finished, then slavery is no longer legal, but could you talk about what you see as these legacies?
Well, look, the hard truth is, and again, many very fine historians and journalists too have contributed to our understanding of this. The old story that, one day there was slavery, and then on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slaves, which of course is not strictly true. He issued an order that slaves in territory still in rebellion against the United States were emancipated. But that old story, and that the 13th Amendment brought slavery to an end, and then we entered into an era of human racial equality in the United States. By now, you have to be pretty naive to believe that that's an adequate story. I mean, there was the noble experiment of Reconstruction in which the federal government tried to confer basic civil rights on the former slaves of the South. That project lasted for 12 years, made some very significant headway, but then was rolled back, repudiated, and reversed. White people found all kinds of ingenious and clever ways to utilize the labor of black people at minimal, if any, compensation. In some cases, at no compensation, by putting them on chain gangs, having them arrested and convicted for crimes like vagrancy, and hundreds of thousands of black people in the South continued to be mercilessly exploited for the balance of the 19th century. One response, very understandable response to that situation, was the great migration of in some cases, former slaves or the children of former slaves from the South to the North. And we all know the struggles in the North for equal opportunity, for integrated education. In some ways, the North proved to be more resistant to integration than the South, and we find ourselves now living in a country where our schools are at least as much, if not more, segregated as they were before Brown v. Board of Education. So, I don't wish to deny, not at all, that the United States has made significant progress in race relations. I think it is a very significant event that an African American was elected and reelected President of the United States. We certainly see the emergence of a strong black middle class that once was very small and fragile. I would like to believe that outright racist sentiments of the kind that politicians had no problem expressing from the 19th century all the way to the last third of the 20th century, that we've come to a point where a politician can't say certain things in public and get away with it, though we all know that there are ways to whisper and hint. The metaphor is dog whistle, right? And appeal to the racial resentments of people. So, we've made progress, and we must continue to make progress. But to pretend that the legacy of slavery has been dealt with, that the crushing burden that was imposed on millions of people in the United States for 250 years, and then you wave a piece of paper and say, well, this is over and done with, and now we're on an equal footing, that's just fantasy land. And, I mean, of course, you didn't have me on today to discuss complex questions like affirmative action, which is a very complicated topic, but that we still have to wrestle with the legacy of slavery in all walks of American life is something that I think is undeniable. So, I'm not in the prescription business. I don't have any deeper insight than anybody else into what the right solutions are. I certainly think that we ought to do whatever we can to allow every American citizen to vote. That would be a good start. But to pretend that our history is not a dark one on the issue of race is to put our heads in the sand.
Well, I'd like to wrap this up with one final question, and I guess it's a secret wish of every historian that we can nudge the historiography of a period, which could then filter down to college textbooks and high school textbooks and maybe nudge the collective memory on a particular topic. So if you could change one bit of memory about this period that you wrote on, about the fugitive slave period, that could filter into the collective consciousness, what would that be?
Well, it's very hard to answer that question without sounding self-serving. I think that,
I give you full permission.
Okay. I think I've told an important story in this book. It's not an unknown story, but the full human dimension of it, which of course I couldn't convey completely, but I did my best. The full human dimension of the experience of human beings fleeing from slavery and the way they forced the society to come to terms with the reality of slavery is a story that all Americans ought to know better than they do. So, and I tried to write this book so that people could read it. It's not a book for experts. I mean, I hope it will withstand the scrutiny of scholars, but it's a book for people. And so, the most candid and honest answer to your question is I hope people will read the book and think about it and talk with their neighbors about it. So that's the best I can do with that one.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, the book is The War Before the War. And thank you for this discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Delbanco.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, that was the episode for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. First of all, I'd like to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, and especially our spy masters, Baron Fraser, Carl from Norway, Chris Romaine, Moondoggy from Ohio, and Rick Knowlton, and I'll explain what that means in a second. If you want to support the show and help me keep producing this content, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, subscribe to the show and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to do that, you can go to historyunplugpodcast.com and there you'll find instructions. 2, join our Facebook group, which you can find if you just search for History Unplugged. And please like and share posts that I put up about new episodes. 3, submit a question to me so that I can answer it on air. You can email me at info@historyonthenet.com or leave a voicemail. And again, go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com and you'll find instructions. Lastly, and I think this one is the best, is to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were an elite reconnaissance and espionage detachment of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the History Unplugged